wish my office wasn't such a mess. I can't fix it now, though.
Alrighty, and we are live on YouTube. I'm going to go ahead and start recording and we can get started whenever you guys are comfortable. If you want to wait until 8 o'clock so that we have let those last couple of people log in, that's totally fine, but I'm going to go ahead and start recording now.
Sure. So let's just give it a couple more minutes, and at 8 o'clock sharp, we'll start sharing our information. Okay, I think I'll go ahead and share our slides. And if you guys don't mind, I'll go ahead and stop sharing my camera. I'll bring it back when we have a discussion. Okay. Okay, well, I think we'll go ahead and start. Welcome, guys, to the Network and Learn series webinar. As you know, it's conducted by UDL IRN, a wonderful, wonderful group of UDL fans. Thank you for joining us to discuss what really do we know about measuring UDL. And we will have some answers for you, but we also will have some questions for you as we go through. So just to let you know, my name is Anya Evmenova. I'm an associate professor at George Mason University, and my co-presenter is Kim Johnson, as assistant professor at Minnesota State University. Both of us are part of the research team at UDL-IRN, and we are both huge fans of UDL across all different environments. We teach using UDL, about UDL, we research about UDL, so we love all about it. But at this point, we actually would like to find out about you. Who are you? So please respond to a poll question that we will ask Mackenzie to bring up. Yep, it's right here. So the first question is really about your primary role. I can imagine that you're probably wearing multiple hats in your life, but what do you consider as your primary role? If you could answer this question, that would be great. That will give us an idea of who you are. And also, the second question is really about why are you here? What do you want to hear about measuring UDL? Why do you care about this topic? So if you could answer these two questions, that would really be fantastic. Okay. Mackenzie, are we getting any responses?
We are getting responses, yes. So it looks like we have pretty much at least a couple of people from each category.
Wonderful.
Yep.
That's fantastic. And if there is a way to save those answers, that would be great. But it sounds like we have a breadth of professionals here, and hopefully each of you will find something interesting about this presentation. So I'll go ahead and stop the poll. I think I can do that. Okay, and we'll move on. Okay. So today, we're really trying to address these areas. We want to discuss the reasons for measuring UDL implementation, but really briefly, just to give us the context. Oh, and I can see the results of the poll now. Wonderful. We do have a wide representation. Amazing. Welcome, everybody. That's great. Okay. So we'll really briefly sort of set up the context for why we even care about this topic. We also hope to share with you some of the existing tools that measure various aspects of UDL. And this is where I do hope that you will find something that can be useful to you in whatever role you have. And we also hope to explore throughout the presentation, and at the end there will be some time for discussion to explore your needs related to UDL measurement. That will give us an idea of what we need to do as a research team, committee at UDL-IRN, as researchers. What do we need to better support those of you who either implement UDL, provide professional development about UDL, conduct research about UDL, and so forth. Now, this is a very broad topic, and we do not intend to have a comprehensive discussion. I don't think it's possible to have a comprehensive discussion about this in an hour, but we will try to sort of scratch the surface, and hopefully it will give you either useful information, as I said, or maybe it will inspire you to dig deeper and get some more information about measuring UDL. So why do we even care, and why do we even talk about measuring UDL implementation? Well, as UDL becomes more and more popular, people in different roles are really starting to crave the data on the effectiveness of UDL. actually, the data on the effectiveness of UDL is required by law. We know that both reauthorization of IDEA and Higher Education Opportunity Act include UDL in them, and they do talk about the need to have the data to support the implementation. But also, as you all know, UDL is a very complex process. It's not a strategy that works exactly the same way in every setting. It's not something that you can just follow as a recipe and be done with it. Actually, a lot of people who support UDL and who are fans of UDL, they say that this complexity and this uniqueness of UDL is a huge advantage of it. UDL really sort of aims to remove the barriers, right? And those barriers are based on the unique characteristics of very specific learners that you have in your particular learning environment. So you really cannot make this too general. It is unique, and there is a beauty about it. But before we can start talking about the effectiveness of UDL, we really need to find ways to recognize how this UDL theory is being translated into this unique practice. Before we can talk about the outcomes, we need to make sure that UDL is happening, right? So we really try to make this, presentation about how do we measure UDL very practitioner sort of based and friendly. But I will briefly mention that all the information that we present today is actually based on the review of published literature. We reviewed a lot of articles. Actually, it was pretty comprehensive literature search. So I can tell you that I think we reviewed all the articles published between 2000 and 2017 on UDL. And we didn't evaluate if it was actually the UDL that was described in the article. It was if the authors claimed that they implemented UDL, we reviewed that article. So as you can see, we reviewed quite a bit of articles because we really wanted to make sure that when we talk about the measurement and when we talk about the instruments, we talk about the validated instruments. There may be more tools out there, but if they haven't been used in research, we wouldn't know how reliable and valid those instruments are. So to begin this discussion, we really wanted to start with something that we trusted, that was validated. So among all those articles, 285, we found only 41 of those actually reported measuring UDL implementation. In other words, there was at least one sort of UDL related measure, right? And only 27 of those 41 actually included either partial or whole instrument. As you can see, the numbers are puzzling, right? We publish a lot about UDL, but we don't really measure UDL implementation. But there were some studies, as you can see here, that did use the UDL-related measures, and we will use some examples today to talk about how UDL implementation can be measured. And these were our categories that sort of emerged through that review. And I can tell you that the vast majority of studies focused on measuring educators' or students' perceptions towards UDL. So this first category with its subcategories was the largest category of all. So in most studies, in some shape or form, there was a questionnaire or an interview or something where the researchers tried to figure out what educators and students actually think about UDL. Now, a few studies reviewed how UDL was applied in teachers' lesson planning. And then there was a handful of studies that used some sort of observation protocol where they could see that UDL implementation. And we will talk about all these categories briefly. If you ask me, I think the last category is the most interesting, but we will get there very soon. So hopefully you will find something that maybe you can use or something that you can modify and use in your environments. So among the UDL perceptions, some instruments focused on the self-efficacy, and that was self-efficacy of in-service and pre-service teachers. So there were some studies that looked at in-service, some studies that looked at pre-service teachers. So basically, these were instruments that looked into how comfortable do teachers feel about implementing UDL? How do they feel about it? Self-efficacy is the belief that we have in our own abilities, and specifically in our ability to meet the challenges and to be successful. As you can imagine, self-efficacy actually is quite important in the UDL world because it can be quite challenging. It is complex. It's not an easy solution. So here are some sample questions from an existing instrument. But more importantly, I wanted you to see some sample questions, but more importantly, why would someone want to measure the self-efficacy of UDL implementation? Well, actually, self-efficacy plays a major role in how we handle challenges, as I said. So self-efficacy is also intertwined with motivation. So whether you are a researcher or maybe you are a practitioner interested in implementing UDL in your classroom, in your school, in your learning environment, you may want to consider adding some way to measure the self-efficacy of your participants. Whether you borrow some of these questions or you develop your own, measuring self-efficacy is really important because we do need to make sure that whoever implements UDL, they are comfortable doing that and they are comfortable with the challenges that UDL brings. Now, you could do this in sort of a pre-test, post-test format to examine the effectiveness of your professional development or your training or maybe your on-the-job coaching, whatever it is that you're doing with your teachers. So self-efficacy is something that is actually great as a pre-test and post-test measure. So just something to think about. Now, another interesting example, in this one study, they used a researcher-developed survey to identify faculty's stages of concern about and levels of use using the 9 specific UDL guidelines in their classes. So that was quite interesting. And here is an example. So sample survey items and the explanation of how each response choice was aligned with the stages of concern, and then at the bottom with the levels of use. So you can see here that each guideline, UDL guideline, was taken and sort of broken into these levels of concern or stages of concern and levels of use. So this is a good example of something very concrete. So if you're interested in more than just what people think about implementing UDL, if you want to have more concrete questions about their implementation, then you could borrow something like this, an idea like this. Or you could actually borrow this whole instrument because it has been validated in previous research. So we, interestingly, several studies that we reviewed reported that they measured the knowledge of UDL, and that was exciting. We said, yay, people are measuring the knowledge of UDL. However, after a more careful review of each instrument in those studies, we found out that it was more about the sort of perceived or self-reported knowledge of UDL. So you can see here some sample questions in this category. So in this particular study that I'm citing here, they actually supplemented those self-reports with the artifact analysis. So they looked at the actual lessons and they kind of compared self-reported knowledge of UDL or knowledge of using UDL principles to increase student engagement. Well, they actually looked at the lessons and they said, did they actually do that or not? So there was a little bit more value to this self-reported knowledge. So that was good. But to tell you the truth, we found it to be surprising that we didn't find a single instrument, a single tool that focused on measuring the actual knowledge of UDL. Something that would include questions like, what are the 3 UDL principles? Or multiple means of representation principle focuses on the following. So I am actually interested about what you think about it. Do we need an instrument like that? Do we need to measure the actual knowledge of UDL principles, guidelines, and checkpoints before we can expect some sort of implementation of UDL in the classroom? Feel free to respond either in the chat or on Twitter. We will come back to your responses. I won't wait for them now, but we will come back to this at the end of our presentation. But I'm just curious, is self-reported knowledge of UDL enough? Do we need to have a way to actually measure the real knowledge of UDL? Maybe it's not. Just curious to hear what you think about it. Interestingly, several studies looked into UDL as a way to provide inclusive instructional practices. So specific to UDL, some items in these studies focused on multiple means of representation, inclusive lecture strategies, inclusive assessments, accessible materials, providing alternative materials, and individualized instruction. So, it really makes sense that UDL was used as a way to provide inclusive practices, because UDL has been promoted as a way to ensure that students actually access the general curriculum, not just the general education classroom, right? So that's where in the 90s when UDL started, that was the whole premise of, we got our students into the general education classrooms. Now let's make sure they have access to the curriculum. And it kind of makes sense. But I'm sure that you are not surprised that the findings in these studies, and regardless of the year, so you can see that the 2 examples I have here are from 2007 and 2016, but regardless of the year, the findings suggest that instructors actually lacked confidence in their knowledge of UDL. So I guess we're not doing enough to make sure that instructors feel comfortable with implementing UDL. So in this particular example, they investigated the beliefs of teaching assistants, graduate teaching assistants who will graduate soon and will become instructors in colleges and higher education, about including diverse learners in their teaching and in their teaching practices. So you can see in the example here that the observed practices were aligned with the principles of Universal Design for Instruction, UDI, a framework that is sort of parallel to UDL or similar to UDL that is widely used specifically in higher education settings. As a result, UDI was used to provide a structure for orientation for these teaching assistants. So they actually use something like this to teach these teaching assistants how to be more inclusive in their practices. So similarly, you might be interested in developing something like this, aligning teaching practices with UDL. Or if you work in higher education, maybe you could just use this tool. Now, the majority of published research has focused on measuring students' attitudes towards UDL practices. And that was done through interviews and questionnaires primarily. Now, that includes K-12 students' perceptions when the teachers would use UDL strategies in their classes, and then students would be asked, so what do you think about this? Was this a good idea? Did it make you feel more included? Did you feel like you had a better access to content, and questions like that? That also included university students, and that was actually students with and without disabilities, so in different studies, but their perceptions on the value and the perceived effectiveness of UDL strategies. So asking students, do you feel like you did better in this course because of the UDL strategies that the instructor used? And then the perceptions of online students on their sort of perceived benefits of UDL or UDI. It's interesting that the only study, and it's marked by Bunge and colleagues, and it's marked with a little asterisk, that's the only study that also included usage statistics and final grades as their measures. All other studies only included that one instrument that focused on students' attitudes towards UDL. So I thought it was interesting that it was only sort of one way to look to measure UDL implementation, just the perceptions, just the attitudes, and only one study actually tried to corroborate the information they got in their analysis. Okay, here is an example of how a validated instrument, and you can see that on the left side. These were the questions from a validated individualized classroom environment questionnaire, right? And they were modified or rephrased, and you can see those on the right side. And you can see, especially in this item number 3, so it went from students choose their partners for group work to students chose the way they learn best to complete assignments using technology, working independently, working with partners, which really kind of gets more into the UDL. So this is just an example of how you can take something that's not UDL related and really modify it and make it work for your UDL measure. Okay, well, as I said, measuring students and instructors' perceptions and attitudes had a huge prevalence in our review. There were a few studies that took a different approach to measuring the knowledge and application of UDL, and those were the lesson plan reviews. So a series of studies used either an original or an adapted rubric from this study, from Spooner and colleagues, 2007. So they either used exactly the same rubric or they modified it slightly. In most cases, they used it as the pre-test, post-test. So teachers were asked to develop a lesson plan, and it was scored using this rubric. And then there was some sort of professional development or training, and teachers were asked to develop another lesson plan, and it was scored using the same rubric. And as you can see here on the slide, the reliability, scoring the lesson plans by multiple people was super important, because in this case, you know, it can be very subjective. But in this particular study and in all other studies that use this format, they actually reached a very high reliability. So I just wanted to show you some examples. So here is an example of the lesson plan rubric specific to multiple means of engagement. You can see you could get a 0, a 1 point, or a 2 points on that. And this is an example for multiple means of representation. And they are worded sort of similarly. And then this is an example of multiple means of action and expression. But I will tell you from my personal experience, when I teach a course about UDL, I think it's very important to ask your participants, if you're using something like this, to really explicitly align students' characteristics and the reported barriers from the case study or the observed classroom, whatever they were using, with those alternative ways, right? So here we're looking at whether the teachers included alternative methods in their lesson plans, right? Just including a certain number of alternative methods doesn't really make sense to me. So in this particular case, they would get 2 points if they included 2 or more alternative methods. And that's great, right? But what does it mean? Maybe one alternative is enough, right? You really need to align the barriers that you have with those alternatives. It's not about just adding all bells and whistles that you can think of. It's really about being, proactive and intentional in your use of different methods. But I thought this was a good example to share with you. It's an interesting approach to measuring people's knowledge of UDL. Can they actually incorporate what they've learned into their lesson plans? And now as we transition, and I'm going to stop sharing my screen and allow Kim to start her part, which actually I think is the most interesting part, talking about the observation tools and various ways to see if UDL is taking place in the learning environment. I want you to take just a minute and reflect on what you've heard so far. Were there any surprises or aha moments? Do you wish that there was a different way to measure perceptions and self-perceived knowledge of UDL? Do we need other ways to measure their actual knowledge of UDL? Just write down your thoughts in the chat window or in the Twitter. And again, we will discuss them at the end. Okay, so I'm going to stop sharing my screen and let Kim take control. Okay, Kim, you're on.
Okay, are there any comments in the chat box that we should address before we move forward?
There are some, but I think we'll just come back to those comments at the end and just discuss all of it.
Okay. Okay, so as Anya said, there are a few studies that addressed observations of UDL in online learning environments and also in classrooms. So I'm going to show you examples of 2 online learning environment observation tools, an example of a UDL section of a classroom observation tool, and an example of UDL Implementation Fidelity tool that can be used in any learning environment. So one tool that you can use to measure UDL in an online learning or measure online learning products is the SCAN tool, created by Basham, Smith, and Satter. So this tool looks at each of the UDL guidelines and asks a question and then probes a little bit more into more specific questions. So for example, one question might be, let me go back to this one, yeah. So one question, for example, 1.2, offer alternatives for auditory information. And they first ask, does the product that you're looking at allow the user to control the narration of content? And then it goes on to ask another question, does the product offer ASL? Does it offer text equivalence? Does it offer transcription? That sort of thing. I have a QR code here that will take you right to the page where you can find this, a website, looks like this. where you can find this tool. And actually what you do is download a copy of the Google form that is the tool. And it generally looks like this for each of the questions it's addressing. And then it also gives you an analysis in the end after you've used these, so you can get lots more information there. Another study looked at 3 different instruments for virtual online environments. So the virtual environment tool was designed to quantify the level at which the online environment has the capacity to align with the UDL framework. The teacher tool measures the teacher's ability to include UDL principles during lesson planning and implementation. And then the student tool was developed to measure the student's use of the tool and their learning outcomes associated with each of those. And here's examples of these. So in this publication, they gave just these examples. You would have to contact the authors for the tool itself. And I think that's the case with even the ones that Anya was mentioning previously. So the environmental tool would look at things like, to what degree does the environment provide opportunities for students or teachers to use multiple tools for construction? The teacher observation tool, looking at students are guided to set goals. Teacher does not guide or set goals. Teacher sets goals for students, and looking at kind of what is done in each of those situations. And then the students observation tool is looking at, to what degree do students use multiple media to demonstrate lesson objectives, and so forth. Another study looked at UDL as a support for learning. So in this study, UDL is included as a component on a classroom observation tool, and observers coded the frequency with which UDL features were evident in the classroom. So here's an example of what that one might look like. Again, these were examples that were provided in the publication. So I wanted to mention here in my department, I'm a professor at MSU Mankato, Minnesota State Mankato, and we have a similar situation where we have developed an observation tool for our students in our special education graduate and undergraduate program. And the tool is very explicit instruction oriented, and we do have a section on our tool that specifically addresses universal design for learning. And we've gone back and forth on whether or not to include a specific section in our tool like they've done here. To measure UDL, or whether we should embed UDL throughout all of the components of the tool. And we've gone back and forth, and our most recent thinking is that by including it in its own section, it gets the attention that we want it to have. Because we noticed when we've embedded parts of UDL throughout the tool, our students tend to breeze by those parts, and our university supervisors who are observing instruction during student teaching experiences, for example, also tend to kind of breeze by those parts and not give them the full attention that we want them to. So when it's addressed as a separate component on an observation tool, it tends to get the attention we're hoping that it does. Another tool is a tool that I developed as part of my dissertation study in 2014. I developed a UDL Implementation Fidelity tool to use because my study looked at whether the use of UDL principles during instruction improved the engagement of students with disabilities, and all students, but I was looking specifically at students with disabilities. And I needed a UDL Implementation Fidelity tool because I felt like, how could I say that UDL was the thing that was making students more engaged in instruction if I couldn't say, I know UDL is happening because of this, this, and this. And so I developed this tool because I needed a tool, and I couldn't find one out there that was going to work. So the tool examines instructional techniques and strategies planned and implemented during the course of a lesson. And a lesson could be a one-day lesson, or it could span several days. And it looked at the level of UDL implementation, either not being UDL, moving toward UDL, or being robust UDL under each principle. So here's kind of what the tool includes. It has an information page. It has one page for each of the UDL principles, and then it has a scoring tool that goes along with it. On the next slides, I'm going to show you the page that addresses each of the principles, and then the piece of the scoring tool that goes along with it, so you can have a better understanding of what it looks like. First, though, I wanted to mention that on this introductory page, in the beginning, when I first developed this, I didn't have anything other than the general demographics here and then some directions. And I've been working on expert validation of the tool and sending this out to other UDL experts, and got feedback that they would like something included on the tool that's addressing the components of a lesson plan in general. So my thinking originally was, if I am working with teachers to implement UDL in their classrooms, I'm assuming that they have a measurable lesson objective and aligned assessment in mind, and then also aligned methods and materials. And if not, then I make sure that I address those items and those issues first. But other researchers have told me that they, and professional development providers have told me that they wanted to have a component on the tool that would make sure and address that, right? So that they wouldn't be able to not cover that. So that's why I've included those here, so we can be sure that that is in place before we move on to thinking about UDL. So here is one of all three pages look like this. And so here's kind of the example, multiple means of representation, and then the guidelines that go underneath that principle. So first of all, I want to make sure that you understand this is not a checklist. Some people have glanced at this and thought, oh, it's a checklist. I want to be able to check as many of these off as possible, but that's not what's happening here. So what you'll see on each of the components, each of the guideline sections, is that there's generally a item or two on the top of each list that would definitely indicate UDL is not happening. So look at this one, for example, number 2 here. The guideline is broken, or first of all, kind of reworded into a question into really easy to understand language. So how is understanding of information supported during this lesson? And then the first item here is learners were left to their own devices to understand information as it was represented. So if that's what happened during the lesson, and remember, we're thinking about the lesson over the course of the whole lesson, not just one day of the lesson. So if learners were left to their own devices to be able to properly perceive and understand the information, then that would be checked. If that was not the case, and some of these other items were what was happening, then any or all or some or a few of these items would be checked. Then when we get lower in each of the individual lists, usually the last item before other, there's an item that indicates what I think is a more robust level of UDL implementation, where we're actually asking the teacher who designed the lesson and delivered the lesson, was there something in place where the support was intentionally made accessible and customizable by the individual learners? And so if things like that were in place, then that would be checked, and that would indicate a more robust level of UDL implementation. So then over here, you see the piece of the scoring tool that goes with this page of the observation tool. And you can see here, it gives you very specific directions, and the directions are specific to each individual item on the tool. So for number 1 here, for example, if only items 1 and 2 and or 3 are checked, that means the information was only presented orally or in print or digital print. So this would mean the teacher gave a lecture and had a PowerPoint. Then that's not UDL. If some of those were used plus some other things, maybe the text was available in digital format, maybe there were decoding supports like text-to-speech software in place in number 2, for example, then that indicates a movement toward UDL. And then when you see what you see on the scoring tool on the far right here is examples where we've included those very last items that indicate a customizability of the things that are in place to support the learners. And that's what it looks like on each of the pages for the principles of UDL. So it's not a checklist, it's items that are representative. The other thing I want to say about this is that we could not possibly list in this middle section here, the movement toward UDL, we couldn't possibly list everything that a teacher might have in their toolbox to make available to students. And so we didn't try to do that. And that's what I mean when I'm saying this is not a checklist. This is just a set of examples in this middle section here. And then we also have other on each of these, because we're hoping that people will write in, oh, well, I maybe didn't do these, but I did this, this, and this. And we would know then that that is also movement toward UDL. Or maybe they're going to say other, and they have a really unique or interesting way that is making these strategies and techniques customizable by the learner. And then that would indicate a robust level of UDL implementation. And then the same is happening for multiple means of engagement, same kind of setup. This is what the scoring tool looks like in its one-page format. And as I mentioned, it's very specific scoring for each of the individual guidelines, so that observers can really see what's happening in each, excuse me, each section. Another thing I want to mention about this tool is that it isn't, it wasn't never meant to be used as an evaluative tool. And I've used this in my dissertation study, and I'm using this in a study that I'm doing with the local school district now. And I found that it actually is really almost used more by teachers as a way to guide their lesson planning and their instructional design as they're putting a lesson together when they're wanting to implement a UDL kind of classroom environment. When I go in and observe teachers, what comes out of this tool is for me to be able to tell them, it looks like you're really strong in providing lots of choices for your learners in multiple means of action and expression, but it looks like you're struggling a little bit with providing options for learners to express their knowledge or show you that they've mastered a particular thing. So maybe I can, and then I go on to help coach them and help them come up with new ways to do that. So what it really ends up doing is giving teachers kind of an indicator for themselves, rather than just going on impressions, and rather than an observer just going on impressions, they can kind of see in a more quantifiable way where they're not implementing parts of UDL that could be beneficial, and where they're doing really, really well with implementing parts of UDL.
So Kim, one of the questions about this tool is whether it's designed to be self-reflective or a peer review kind of tool.
That's a good question. I feel like the teachers that I have been working with use it both ways. My teacher teams that are working together at the school that I'm doing a study with right now, I have a fourth grade team, a kindergarten team, a second grade team, and they're using it in a way where they're reflecting with each other and kind of helping and coaching each other. But teachers are also using it as a way to kind of look at their own practice, and I think it's beneficial in both of those ways.
So before we move into the discussion, Kim, I'm sure you're not surprised, but a lot of people are interested in getting a copy of your tool.
Yes, I would love that. I am continuing to work on validating the tool. I used it, as I said, in my dissertation study. I'm working on actually writing up results right now for a survey that I sent out asking other UDL researchers and other UDL experts to give me input on the tool. And I would love to send this out to people and kind of talk about a method for doing that so that I could use their results to help validate this tool. So people should just email me and I will have a conversation with them about how we can connect.
Wonderful. And you guys will get, if you're interested, you can get the slides, and both our email addresses are there. So if you would like a copy, I would suggest contacting Kim directly, because she probably would want some sort of information from you about how you're planning to use this tool, as she is continuing to validate it. But we're really at the point of this discussion, and we really want to figure out what you guys need. What kind of measures do you need? And I did go through the chat, and there was some discussion about measuring the actual knowledge of UDL versus the perceived knowledge. And as one of you said, while sort of the knowledge of UDL is not, you know, the only thing, it's not the only thing that will determine effective implementation. Many of you say that it might be sort of a good way to measure if people even know what they're talking about. And I do think, in my personal opinion, I do think it's important to separate that good teaching from UDL. In my opinion, that happens because of that intentionality. So, you know, it's not, you added all these wonderful things, not just because you've read about them on Facebook, but you know, it was actually intentional because you were trying to remove a specific barrier that exists in your learning environment. Some people also mentioned Learning Designed, which is a wonderful resource for sure. Check it out if you don't know about it. It is, you can create your own accounts. Well, as far as I know, I've only done it through this personal use. So do tell me if it's different, but you could sort of measure your own knowledge of UDL when you go through the certification. But it probably, if you were thinking of a tool for your whole school district or for you know, a whole bunch of teachers, it might, Learning Designed might be harder to manage with a large number of participants. So definitely a wonderful tool for your own self, you know, identification of where you are at what level, and getting the certification and the credentials. Yeah, there was one question which I thought, I was like, did I write that question in the chat box? It was about, you know, do we have randomized control trials that report the objective UDL effectiveness or effects? And to tell you the truth, you know, the memory may be failing me after reviewing more than almost 300 articles. I don't think there was a single randomized control trial, but there were some group experimental studies. So there were quite a few sort of quasi-experimental studies. But one of the issues here is, again, you know, before we can talk about the effectiveness of UDL, how do we make sure that what's happening in the classroom is UDL? And that's where I think tools like CAMS and some other of those observation tools might be a good way to, you know, incorporate, at least to provide information about the fidelity implementation, that we are implementing UDL with fidelity in our classrooms. So we really, really want to hear from you. And if you could just let us know, you can raise your hand and request control of your microphone, or you can just type in, you know, what do you need in order to measure UDL implementation? What kind of tool would you love to have tomorrow when you go in your, you know, learning environment, wherever you are? And, you know, how can we help you as researchers? What kind of tools do we need to be developing and validating? Okay, we have a hand raise. Mackenzie or Sue, can you?
Yep, so Alice, you are allowed to talk if you can unmute yourself.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
We can.
Yes.
So I work in the K-12 environment, And to get administrators to get on board, a tool that measures student improvement, or how it's really impacting the student, not just their perception, but more along the line of perception from the student, as well as actual change of behavior in the classroom, let's say, as an example, in terms of how they're engaging. So like those sort of tools would be very useful in, especially the secondary, like high school level, because when out coaching, sometimes the high school teachers are harder to convince to try to try to implement UDL strategies in the classroom.
Right.
That's really.
And administrators are looking for just academic outcomes even, right? But unfortunately, there just isn't much out there that is tying UDL to academic outcomes in schools. And one of the reasons is because we have to be able to say, we know UDL is happening, and we know it's happening because of this, this, and this, before we can say the good or bad academic outcomes are because of UDL. And so that's the issue. In the study I'm working on right now in a local school district, we are in discussions about that, because the teachers that I'm working with are constantly frustrated because they're planning and they're implementing some UDL assessments, right? When they teach something, kids have options for how they show their learning, but they are still required to give the paper pencil district mandated assessment that goes with every unit of study, right? And so what we're discussing right now is the possibility of, well, how about if we do both, and then we can look at this assessment showed that the paper pencil assessment, maybe it was the same, or maybe we could say the student did better on the UDL assessment because they were able to show their learning in the way that works best for them. And we can start talking to the administration and superintendent, right? All of the people who are very, very concerned about test scores and things like that, and we can kind of start to show them. But there was no possible way we could go in and say, hey, throw out those paper pencil tests and just do the different UDL assessments that you've come up with, because the administrators weren't going to be on board with that.
Right. And I will tell you, Alice, that so all those other studies, right? So only 41 of the studies we reviewed included a UDL related measure. All other studies had other measures, right? So some of them were researcher created sort of tests, right? And they were content related. If it was a study about science, there would be a science test that students take, right? But I think what Kim has already mentioned, for us, it was surprising that there was not a related or used in conjunction an instrument that would actually measure UDL implementation. So, we can claim that we implemented UDL and look at these outcomes, they are fantastic. But, unless someone who is knowledgeable about UDL goes through and kind of says, yeah, that does look like UDL, it doesn't help those administrators who want to see clear data. So, in our opinion, there needs to be both. There needs to be sort of the academic outcomes as well as the UDL implementation measures. But also something that you mentioned was related to engagement. That's an area that I believe everybody I talk to at UDL, IRN Summit or other conferences is always interested in engagement, and engagement is so hard to measure. It's not just on task, off task that you can define, operationally define, right? So that's another complex beast that we need to tackle.
I know, because it's kind of like the chicken and the egg thing, to convince an administrator that they should put their energy behind this. They want to see that student engagement and academic performance is going to happen. Right. But I also agree with you that you first also have to see, that's why I was really excited about the tool, and the idea of coaching teachers about what UDL should really look like in the classroom. you need to have implementation with Fidelity first.
Right.
So it's just so hard to figure out how to make this happen for our students at the secondary level, because the elementary school principals and teachers seem to want to buy into it a lot quicker when I do coaching with them. But if they're doing so well in elementary and then they go into a secondary environment, which is when it really counts for them, a lot more if you think about state testing, then they change environments and they go back to an old environment, then all the good work done in elementary is lost.
Right.
So it's just kind of hard to figure that out.
Yeah. Well, the content becomes harder in secondary school, right? So
yeah,
it's something that I'm sort of trying to tackle right now. We have a new NSF project where we are embedding UDL in the computer science instruction. And, UDL cannot be an add-on. It has to be talked about at the very beginning. But these teachers are so scared of computer science part of it. They don't know how to teach it. They intimidated, they're overwhelmed, that it's that balance of you have to be somewhat comfortable with the content you teach in order to be able to think about anything else.
I agree with that. I tend to support a lot of math teachers, and it has the same issue comes up there as well.
Right. Well, some of the other ideas in the chat, a tool for teacher walkthroughs. I agree that it would be great, and I do agree that something like that would bring in that intentionality, like why are we making certain decisions in our instruction. Yeah, I think it's definitely a two-step process for me, and that is my personal opinion, that we cannot talk about the outcomes, student outcomes, without talking about the fidelity of implementation. And it is hard because it is different, it is unique in each environment, and that's wonderful. But I still think that we need to be mindful of how it is happening. And it might be different in one place versus another place, but we do need to be able to measure that UDL is implemented in both of those environments. And that's where I think that comparison with a non-UDL environment would be important, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I saw somebody in the chat mentioned Hyatt. Yes, I'm with Montgomery County Public Schools, and we do have a process that we do for walkthroughs.
Yes.
So, and it does work really well. Like I said, we have a lot more success a lot of times with our elementary schools.
Right.
But really trying to get that process going in high school in particular is very hard.
Yeah. Well, hopefully we will get there soon enough with your help. Implementing UDL and validating some of these instruments that we're trying to develop and help you. Someone just posted degree of learner agency across time and settings. Yeah, that is great. I will say that in our work as the research committee for UDL IRN, we did look at this research from a different perspective. We looked into what kind of measures do people use that align with that expert learner sort of descriptors, right? So if we are saying that an expert learner is, self-regulated learner, right? What kind of measures do people use to measure that self-regulation. So we have some of that work. We don't have time to talk about it today, but we have looked at it from that other perspective, not just UDL implementation, but also what does it mean to be an expert learner and how can we measure those outcomes, not content-specific outcomes, but really becoming those expert learners. So hopefully we will be sharing this work in the future.
Do we have any research or anything along the lines of when students get to college, like if they think their K-12 experience help them get to that expert learner? You know, like, is there something that can be done or a survey that's out there already that maybe I would be able to like give to an 11th or 12th grader to see if they feel like they're at that level yet? Is there anything out there along those lines?
Not that I know of. And not
Okay.
that I can think of on top of my head. Let me think about it. Let me sleep on it. And if you want to follow up with me, I'll briefly go through my notes about the studies and let you know. There is talk about it though. There is a conversation that we need to have something like that. So hopefully more studies will be coming out in the nearest future, but probably not soon enough for you. But anyway, I will think about it a little bit more and let you know if I can remember something. And we also had a question.
Sorry. I was just thinking that that would be a good way to kind of convince administrators that it's needed if they could see it from a student that they're not ready to be independent in college.
Right. Yeah. Right. Well, let me take this one last question from the chat because I think we're almost out of time. One of the questions was, did we find any studies that failed to find any enhancement of learning by UDL? And I'm not sure if this is what you're asking, Michael, but there were studies that didn't find any difference between the different settings, right? But that goes back to, I'm not 100% sure what was implemented in the experimental classroom was actually UDL. The authors claimed it to be UDL, but after we read the description, we had our sort of, personal concerns about calling that a UDL. For example, just, presenting, there was one about using PowerPoint slides, narrated PowerPoint slides versus regular PowerPoint slides, right? So yes, it could be considered a multiple means of representation, but again, it wasn't tied to the student's characteristics or barriers, and it was very sort of minimal change to the instruction. So there was obviously no difference. So to answer your question, yes, there are studies that didn't find any enhancement of learning, but I will argue that those studies didn't really implement UDL effectively. So, I mean, we'll stick around if you have any final questions. We do have information about the next event. Oh, I think Kim just stopped sharing her screen, but it's also available in the chat window on June 5th. If you want to learn more about UDL implementation, please join the UDL IRN network and series again. Again, we'll stick around, but for those of you who need to jump off, thank you so much for attending and asking such great questions. And it was a pleasure to talk to you tonight. And we're still here if you guys have any additional questions, and you can always contact us via email.
Definitely. Thank you, guys.